Welcome to the fourth talk in our series on mission in the Bible. This week we're moving to the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 29 and first 14 verses. At this point, a number of God's people in Judah have been taken into exile in Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and his forces. And Jeremiah writes a letter to those taken into exile. Not going to read the whole letter, but verses 1 to 14. This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after King Joachim and the Queen Mother, the court officials, and the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the skilled workers, and the craftsmen had gone into exile from Jerusalem. He entrusted the letter to Elasah, son of Shaphan, and to Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. It said, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons, and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile." Sure, most of you have seen The Wizard of Oz, and you'll know the early part of the story where the whirlwind hits Dorothy's home in Kansas. And when it subsides, Dorothy looks around in bewilderment at the strange and different surroundings she finds herself in. And she turns to her dog, Toto, and says, "Toto, I've got a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore." I think Dorothy could be speaking for today's church. We've been caught up in a social whirlwind, and when we've opened our eyes to survey the scene, it looks nothing like what that in which we grew up. The church used to be respected, but no longer. It used to be normal to go to church. No longer. There's a lot of outright hostility towards Christianity. My role as a minister is not respected in the way it used to be. People make very negative assumptions about people like me now. And we might want to skip to the end of the film where Dorothy finds her back in Home Sweet Home and there's no place like it. But it ain't happening soon. Just as Jeremiah said to those exiles, when 70 years are completed for Babylon. And actually, most Christians down the centuries have had to live as faithful disciples as a minority in society. We're not very used to it, but that's very much our calling now. And Jeremiah's letter to the exiles is really helpful on this. He's writing to people who are no longer the majority, they are the minority and very different in Babylon. So, how are they going to live faithfully as witnesses in that culture? Well, there are some lessons in that letter. I'm going to share four with you. The first is about where we live. Build houses and settle down, says God to the exiles in verse 5. You know, the church is no longer the default moral voice in our nation. The, the TV shows, the news programs don't automatically get a religious leader to pronounce on them, do they? And it's no good pining for the good old days. Now we're called to be missionaries in this situation, not in some imaginary golden age of decades ago. Of course, what God calls the exiles to do here is what Jesus did when he came, and what Jesus called the disciples to do. As the Father has sent me, I'm sending you, said Jesus. And Jesus was the Word made flesh who came and dwelt among us. You see, Jesus dwelt among the people. Yes, he occasionally ministered in synagogues, but mostly he didn't say, come here and listen to me. He did his ministry amid people's lives. He made his dwelling among people. You could translate, he made his dwelling among us as he pitched his tent among us. Eugene Peterson puts it like this in The Message: the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. This is our calling. Like Jesus was the presence of God in the middle of life, and we have to be the presence of God in a different way um, in the middle of the life that we're placed in. Our Christian mission can no longer be sustained on the grounds of how are we going to get people to come to us? Because it's not natural for people to come to us now. We have to go to the world and live actively in it as Christians, not swallowing the world's values, but living in the middle of the world faithfully for Jesus, not living in a Christian ghetto. So, firstly, it's about where we live. Secondly, it's about where we work. Plant gardens and eat what they produce, God continues to say in verse 5. Eugene Peterson, in his book The Quest, which is on Jeremiah, says that this means we should become a productive part of the economy of the place. So let's get rid of that idea that the only work worth doing is church work. Work such as mine as a minister is support work for the rest of you who are on the front line of mission as Christ's representatives in the world, pointing to the gospel in word and deed, living lives that are so puzzling and magnetic that people want to ask you about. So when the wife of a former circuit steward of mine told me that her husband wanted to spend more time on the important stuff like church work rather than his occupation and what he was doing in the community, I have to say I was sad. This guy worked in commercial shipping. He helped ensure that vital goods got from one port in the world to another. I mean, if he's not retired by now, I don't know what age he is. I mean, he would be very concerned with all that traffic that's being attacked by the Houthis right now. He was also a governor at his daughter's school. Now, imagine doing these things in a Christ-like way, being a good steward of resources, caring for the well-being of the school community and for the people at work and for the folk on those ships. Imagine doing these things for Christ. That's why I like the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity and their emphasis on whole life discipleship and supporting people who are on the front line. I once heard a story from them about a school teacher who also taught in junior church on a Sunday. Why does my church pray for my junior church work, she asked, when I deal with maybe a dozen children there? But it doesn't pray for my Monday to Friday work when I get the chance to influence so many more children. And that's why LICC developed an idea called This Time Tomorrow, to interview someone in church on Sunday morning and ask them what they were going to be doing at that same time Monday morning and what they'd like prayer for. You know, church doesn't stop when we leave the church building. An Australian Christian leader called James Thwaites put it this way. He said, how far apart from each other do we have to be in order no longer to be the church? 5 yards apart? 5 miles apart? He said, no, we never stop being the church. It's just that on Sunday or in our house groups, we tend to be the church gathered. But in the middle of the week, we are the church dispersed. And out there in our work is Christian work. Thirdly, it's about where we flourish. In verse 6, God says, marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. You know, you're going to be settling down. Put your roots down, even in that pagan land, even though the psalmist said, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? You know, having been part of the majority culture where we haven't had to fight for the place of our faith in public life, we now ourselves find that we're singing the Lord's song in a strange land. And there's a real temptation to be negative and self-pitying about it. But God says it's possible for his people to flourish as minorities. It's what the early church did. It's what all sorts of Christians have done down the centuries. I wonder if you remember the story in Mark chapter 6 where the disciples are rowing their boat on the lake late at night, and they're straining at the oars in the fourth watch of the night, and Jesus comes to them walking on the water. He comes to them, in other words, from outside the boat. Now, the early church read the boat, not just literally, but symbolically. For them, it stood for the gospel community. Maybe Jesus was coming to them from outside the church. Maybe he'd already been at work outside their community, and then he came to them. And some of our task is to find out where Jesus is already working outside. And he's doing stuff ahead of us and calling us to join in because he's getting to work in people's lives so that they might find faith in him. That's why I think I've told you before about Debbie and I lurking with intent at the school gate when our kids were, especially at the lower end of primary school. We made lots of friends in the school community. We let it be known that the kettle was always had water in it if somebody needed our door for tea and coffee. We befriended 3 young mums who were going through horrendous divorces. And when we announced our decision to leave that appointment, some of the church people were rather glad to see the back of me, but some of the community wanted to raise a petition to keep us, including our next door neighbour who was totally clueless about church. And on the last day of the school term in the July, somebody said to us, why don't you come to the park with us? But when we did, we found there were 20 people there from the school community who were throwing a farewell picnic for us. So put your roots down as minorities in these communities outside the church. Get there and shine your light for Christ. It's what we're called to do. The fourth and final thing is it's about where we bless. So in verse 7, God says, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. I mean, contrast that to the way sometimes we react to the decline of Christianity in the West and the rise of ideologies we dislike. Either we start to claim excitedly that God's going to bring revival soon, although note how Jeremiah puts a lid on that one to the exiles. You're going to wait. Or we just rail against the evil and we condemn. But God doesn't call his people here to condemn Babylon. He calls his people to bless it. Not that God's people are to ignore unrighteousness and justice, but what difference would it make if Christians were really known as a people of blessing? And yes, I'm coming back again to that theme of blessing. We often aren't known as people of blessing, you know. Ask MPs in the British Parliament which group of people they don't want to send them letters, and I'm afraid the answer often is Christians, because we're known in Parliament for our complaining and our judgmentalism. Go to the United States and talk to some of the waiters and waitresses in restaurants, especially those on duty on a Sunday lunchtime, where a number of groups from churches will go and have lunch after the service. And sadly, some of them will tell you that it's those church groups who treat them the worst. They moan the loudest and they tip the least. How does that stack up against all the New Testament teaching to bless? Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. What would it look like if we were the people who were always wondering what good we could do unconditionally for people? If we were the people who, rather than complaining, were instead always seeking to put in a good word for someone or leaving a surprise thank you gift for somebody? Do we encourage our elected representatives? Do we tip generously at the restaurant, realizing that that member of staff is either a young student trying to make ends meet on her student loan, or she's working a second job to make ends meet? What if, in the wider society, we were getting involved in those civic and political decisions that affect the well-being of our communities as councillors or business people? That's why, did I quote this last week? Ed Silvoso, the Argentinian preacher, has this wonderful way of putting it. He says, in the celestial poker game, a hand of blessings always beats a hand of curses. So let's go and bless our Babylon. Let's see what happens when Christians start blessing, and wait for the questions about why we do this. And then let's speak about the one who calls us to bless. Thanks for being with me. Please join me again next week for another in this series on Mission in the Bible. God bless you. Bye-bye.